Grace Turner had built her small bakery, Sweet Grace, from nothing, working long hours every single day to turn her grandmother's old recipes into a thriving neighborhood favorite. She was proud of her curves, proud of her hard work, and proud of the little shop that smelled constantly of fresh cinnamon and warm bread. She never expected that her simple, happy life would suddenly attract the attention of one of the most powerful men in the city. Marco Delgado was known throughout the city as a man who got exactly what he wanted, whether through careful negotiation or intimidating pressure. His organization had recently acquired several properties along the same street where Sweet Grace stood, planning a large, important development that required the entire block, including Grace's small corner bakery. Most business owners on the street had accepted his generous offers quickly, eager to avoid any complications with someone as powerful as Marco. Grace, however, was different. When Marco's representative first approached her with an offer of $2 million for her small bakery, Grace calmly declined without hesitation. "This isn't just a building," she explained firmly. "It's my grandmother's legacy. Money can't replace that." The representative returned days later with an increased offer of $5 million, then finally with an extraordinary offer of $10 million, an amount that would have instantly changed most people's lives completely. Grace, however, remained firm, calmly declining each time despite the enormous sum being offered. Frustrated by her repeated refusals, Marco decided to visit personally, curious about the woman bold enough to reject an offer most people would never dream of refusing. He arrived quietly one afternoon, dressed sharply, immediately drawing curious glances from customers inside the small, cozy bakery. Grace, busy decorating a cake behind the counter, glanced up calmly as he approached, unfazed by his obvious wealth and authority. "Mr. Delgado," she said politely, though her tone remained firm and confident. "I assume you're here about your offer." $10 million is quite generous," Marco said calmly, studying her carefully. "Most people wouldn't hesitate." Grace smiled slightly, wiping her hands on her apron before addressing him directly. "I'm not most people," she replied simply. "This bakery isn't for sale, Mr. Delgado. Not for 10 million, not for any amount." Marco raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her calm confidence. "May I ask why?" he asked curiously. Most business owners would jump at such an opportunity. Grace considered her answer carefully before responding honestly. "My grandmother built this bakery from nothing, teaching me everything she knew about baking, about hard work, and about staying true to what truly matters in life," she explained. "She passed away 3 years ago, and this bakery is the only place where I still feel her presence clearly. No amount of money could ever replace that." Marco studied her thoughtfully, clearly unaccustomed to encountering someone so genuinely unmoved by wealth and power. "I understand sentimental value," he said carefully, "but surely you understand the complications refusing my offer could bring." Grace nodded calmly, unwavering despite his subtle warning. "I understand completely," she replied firmly. "But I've built my life around honesty and hard work, not fear, Mr. Delgado. I won't be pressured into abandoning something so meaningful, regardless of the consequences." Marco's men, standing quietly nearby, exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unaccustomed to witnessing anyone speak so directly and confidently to their powerful boss. Marco himself remained silent for a long moment, studying Grace carefully, clearly reconsidering his approach entirely. "You're an unusual woman, Grace Turner," he finally said, genuine respect evident subtly in his tone. "I'll take that as a compliment," Grace replied, a hint of playful confidence returning to her voice. Marco nodded slowly, clearly impressed despite himself. "I'll admit I expected you to eventually accept my offer like everyone else," he said honestly. "But your determination is admirable, even if inconvenient for my plans." Grace shrugged slightly, unbothered by his subtle acknowledgement. "Perhaps you'll need to adjust your plans then," she said simply, returning calmly to decorating her cake. Marco watched her silently for another moment, clearly intrigued by her calm defiance, before turning to leave the bakery without further argument. His men quickly followed him outside, clearly confused by his sudden lack of aggressive insistence. "Boss," one of his men said cautiously once they were outside, "are we going to increase the pressure on her?" Marco paused thoughtfully, staring back briefly toward the cozy, inviting bakery. "No," he said finally, surprising even his own men with his unexpected decision. "Leave her alone for now." His men exchanged confused glances, clearly puzzled by Marco's uncharacteristic hesitation. "But boss, the project requires her property," one of them reminded him carefully. Marco's expression remained thoughtful, his mind clearly working through something deeper than mere business calculations. "I'm aware," he said quietly. "But we'll find another way. For now, I want everyone to leave Grace Turner and her bakery completely alone." As Marco walked away thoughtfully from Sweet Grace Bakery that afternoon, his men remained silent, clearly uncertain about the sudden shift in their boss's usually straightforward business approach. None of them yet understood clearly that Marco's decision wasn't simply about business strategy anymore. It was about a woman who had unknowingly captured his genuine respect and curiosity, someone unlike anyone he had previously encountered in his powerful, complicated world. Days passed after Marco's unexpected decision to leave Grace and her bakery alone, though his curiosity about her only continued to grow steadily. He found himself thinking about her often, replaying their brief conversation repeatedly in his mind, intrigued by the calm confidence she had displayed so effortlessly in front of him. "Boss, the development team is asking about the timeline again," Raphael, Marco's trusted second-in-command, mentioned carefully one afternoon, clearly aware of the unusual delay Marco had created regarding the bakery situation. "Tell them to wait," Marco replied simply, his attention seemingly distracted by other matters. Raphael studied him curiously, noticing clearly the unusual hesitation in Marco's tone. "This isn't like you, boss," he said cautiously. "You've never delayed a project like this before." Marco sighed quietly, acknowledging Raphael's observation honestly. "There's something different about this situation," he admitted. "I want to understand her reasons more clearly before making any further decisions." Raphael raised an eyebrow curiously but chose not to push further, sensing clearly that Marco's decision involved more than simple business calculations. Instead, he quietly arranged for a deeper background investigation into Grace Turner, hoping to satisfy his boss's evident curiosity discreetly. Days later, Raphael returned with a detailed report, presenting it carefully to Marco. "Grace Turner, 29 years old," Raphael began. "She inherited the bakery directly from her grandmother Eleanor Turner, who passed away 3 years ago from a long illness. Grace nursed her grandmother personally through her final years, working tirelessly to keep the bakery running throughout that difficult time." Marco listened intently, genuine interest clear in his expression as Raphael continued. "Since then she's maintained the bakery entirely on her own, turning down multiple opportunities to expand or franchise the business, insisting instead on keeping it exactly as her grandmother originally intended." Marco considered this information carefully, understanding slowly the depth of Grace's emotional connection to her small business. "She's protecting her grandmother's memory," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "It appears so," Raphael confirmed. "Local customers speak highly of her, describing her as warm, generous, and fiercely dedicated to her community. She often provides free bread and pastries to families struggling financially, without any expectation of recognition or repayment." Marco's respect for Grace deepened further upon hearing this additional detail, painting a picture of a genuinely kind and selfless woman, someone deeply committed to values far beyond simple financial gain. "She's exactly the kind of person our world rarely encounters," Marco murmured thoughtfully, almost to himself. Raphael studied his boss carefully, noticing clearly the unusual softness in Marco's expression, something he had rarely witnessed during their many years working together. "Boss," he said cautiously, "are you developing feelings for this woman?" Marco hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Raphael's direct question. "I respect her," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "She's unlike anyone I've encountered in this business. That's all." Raphael nodded slowly, though skepticism remained clear in his expression, sensing there was more to Marco's growing interest than he was willing to openly admit. Meanwhile, unaware of Marco's private investigation and growing admiration, Grace continued running her bakery diligently, unaware that she had captured the genuine attention and curiosity of one of the city's most powerful men. She occasionally wondered why Marco's men hadn't returned to pressure her further, relieved yet slightly puzzled by the sudden silence following their earlier visit. One afternoon, while preparing a fresh batch of cinnamon rolls, Grace's young assistant, Lily, approached her curiously. "Do you think Mr. Delgado will try again?" Lily asked nervously, clearly worried about the bakery's future security. Grace considered the question carefully, uncertain herself about Marco's true intentions. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. "But whatever happens, we'll handle it together just like we always have." Lily nodded, reassured slightly by Grace's calm confidence, though clear worry remained evident in her young expression. Later that same afternoon, Marco found himself once again outside Sweet Grace Bakery, staring thoughtfully through the window at Grace, who was busy assisting customers with genuine warmth and friendliness. He hesitated briefly before finally deciding to step inside once more, uncertain exactly what he intended to say, yet unable to resist the pull of curiosity and admiration drawing him back toward her. Grace looked up, mild surprise crossing her expression as she noticed him entering again. "Mr. Delgado," she greeted cautiously, "back again so soon?" Marco offered a small, genuine smile, something rare and unfamiliar even to himself. "I found myself curious," he admitted honestly. "About your grandmother's recipes, specifically." Grace studied him carefully, surprised by his unexpected interest. "Is that so?" she asked, slight amusement coloring her tone. "Indeed," Marco replied simply. "Perhaps you could recommend something special, something personally meaningful to you?" Grace considered his request thoughtfully, genuine curiosity emerging slowly regarding this powerful yet surprisingly humble man standing before her. "Very well," she said finally, a small genuine smile forming on her lips. "Let me show you something truly special." As Grace turned to prepare a special pastry recipe passed down carefully from her grandmother, neither she nor Marco fully realized clearly how significantly this simple, unexpected moment would soon shape both of their futures, drawing them steadily closer together despite the dangerous complications inevitably awaiting them ahead. Marco's visits to Sweet Grace Bakery became increasingly regular over the following weeks, though he carefully maintained a respectful, professional distance, unwilling to pressure Grace despite his growing personal interest. Their conversations gradually deepened, moving beyond simple pastry recommendations into genuine discussions about life, family, and personal values. Grace found herself surprised by how easily she began looking forward to Marco's visits, despite her initial wariness about his powerful and complicated background. His genuine curiosity, patience, and evident respect for her boundaries slowly earned her cautious trust. However, not everyone within Marco's organization welcomed this unusual delay in acquiring Grace's property. Marco's business partners, particularly a sharp and ambitious investor named Victor Alvarez, grew increasingly frustrated by the ongoing delay. "Marco, this hesitation is costing us valuable time and money," Victor argued sharply during a private meeting. "The entire development depends on acquiring that bakery. Your personal feelings toward this woman shouldn't interfere with sound business decisions." Marco's expression hardened slightly, clearly displeased by Victor's blunt accusation. "This isn't about personal feelings," Marco replied firmly, though his tone lacked complete conviction even to himself. "I'm simply choosing a more strategic, patient approach." Victor studied Marco skeptically, clearly unconvinced by his explanation. "Patience has its limits, Marco," he warned. "If you won't resolve this quickly, I will." Marco's eyes narrowed sharply at Victor's implied threat. "Stay away from her," he warned coldly. "This situation will resolve itself in time, without unnecessary complications." Victor remained silent, though clear frustration and calculated determination lingered behind his eyes as he left the meeting, unwilling to accept Marco's cautious approach any longer. Unbeknownst to Marco, Victor quietly began taking matters into his own hands, arranging privately to pressure Grace directly, hoping to force a quicker resolution to the ongoing delay. A few days later, while closing up her bakery for the evening, Grace encountered two unfamiliar men waiting outside, their expressions cold and intimidating. "Miss Turner," one of them said calmly, though clear threat lingered beneath his controlled tone. "We represent certain investors interested in accelerating your decision regarding the sale of your bakery." Grace's heart pounded anxiously, though she maintained outward composure carefully. "I've already made my decision clear," she replied firmly. "The bakery isn't for sale." The second man stepped closer, his tone growing subtly more threatening. "Perhaps you should reconsider," he said coldly. "Accidents happen easily to those who refuse reasonable offers." Grace's breath caught sharply, fear flooding through her instantly despite her attempts at calm composure. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain firm. "Consider it a friendly warning," the first man replied smoothly before both men turned and walked away calmly, leaving Grace shaken and anxious, alone outside her bakery. Later that evening, Grace called Marco directly, her voice trembling anxiously as she explained the unsettling encounter. Marco listened intently, anger building steadily within him as she described the men's threatening words. "I'll handle this immediately," Marco reassured her firmly, controlled fury evident clearly in his tone. "You're safe, Grace. I promise you that." After ending the call, Marco quickly summoned Raphael, his expression sharp and intense. "Victor's behind this," Marco said firmly, anger evident clearly in his controlled tone. He's threatened Grace directly despite my explicit warning. Raphael's expression grew serious immediately. How do you want to handle this, boss? Marco considered carefully, determination clear in his eyes. Increase security around Grace and her bakery immediately, he instructed firmly. And arrange a private meeting with Victor. It's time he understood clearly the consequences of ignoring my direct orders. Raphael nodded quickly, moving swiftly to arrange the necessary security measures, while Marco prepared himself mentally for a serious confrontation with Victor. The following day, Marco confronted Victor directly, his tone cold and controlled despite the anger simmering clearly beneath the surface. You directly disobeyed my orders, Marco said firmly. I warned you clearly to stay away from Grace. Victor remained defiant, though clear nervousness flickered briefly across his expression. I did what was necessary for our business interests, he replied firmly, though his voice lacked complete confidence. Necessary? Marco repeated coldly. Threatening an innocent woman was never necessary, Victor. This ends now. Victor hesitated, clearly recognizing the seriousness of Marco's anger. Marco, be reasonable, he said cautiously. This is simply business. No, Marco replied firmly, his voice steady and unwavering. This has become personal, Victor. And you've made a serious mistake threatening someone under my protection. Victor's expression shifted uneasily, clearly realizing the severity of his miscalculation. What do you intend to do? He asked cautiously. Marco's gaze remained cold and resolute. You're no longer involved in this project, he said firmly. Consider yourself removed from any further business dealings with my organization, effective immediately. Victor's expression tightened with anger and humiliation, though he understood clearly the futility of arguing further against Marco's firm decision. Reluctantly, he nodded, quietly leaving the meeting, his ambitions clearly thwarted for now. As Marco returned to Grace later that evening, personally ensuring her safety and reassuring her calmly about the resolved threat, both of them understood clearly that their growing connection had evolved into something far deeper and more meaningful than either had initially anticipated. Yet neither realized clearly that Victor's humiliation and anger would soon ignite a far greater danger, one that would test their bond even further in the days ahead. In the weeks following Victor's removal from the project, Marco found himself visiting Sweet Grace Bakery even more frequently, his excuses growing thinner each time, though Grace never seemed to mind his company. Their conversations deepened steadily, moving beyond business and family history into more personal territory neither had expected to share so openly. One quiet afternoon, after the bakery had closed for the day, Marco lingered at a small table while Grace finished cleaning the kitchen. Can I ask you something personal? He said carefully. Grace glanced up, curiosity evident in her expression. Of course, she replied, wiping her hands on a towel before joining him at the table. You seem completely comfortable with yourself, Marco said thoughtfully. Your appearance, your choices, everything about who you are. That kind of confidence is rare. Where does it come from? Grace considered the question carefully, appreciating his genuine curiosity rather than judgment. It wasn't always easy, she admitted honestly. Growing up, people often made comments about my weight, suggesting I should look differently, act differently, apologize somehow for simply existing as I am. Marco listened intently, genuine interest and respect evident clearly in his expression. My grandmother taught me differently though, Grace continued softly. She always said confidence isn't about matching someone else's expectations. It's about knowing your own worth regardless of what others think or say. Marco nodded slowly, admiration clear in his gaze. She sounds like she was an incredible woman, he said sincerely. She was, Grace agreed, warmth evident clearly in her voice. She taught me that real strength comes from kindness, hard work, and staying true to yourself, no matter what pressures or judgments come from outside. Marco studied her closely, genuine respect and admiration deepening steadily within him. I've met many powerful, wealthy people in my life, he admitted quietly. But few possess the genuine strength and confidence you carry so naturally. Grace smiled softly, touched by his sincerity. Thank you, Marco, she said gently, using his first name comfortably for the first time. That means more than you realize. Their relationship continued deepening steadily over subsequent weeks, Marco visiting regularly, sometimes helping Grace close the bakery, other times simply enjoying quiet conversations over coffee and pastries. Despite the dangerous complications of his own world, Marco found himself genuinely happy, more at ease than he had felt in years. Raphael noticed the change clearly, mentioning it carefully one afternoon. "You seem different lately, boss," he observed. "Happier, somehow." Marco smiled slightly, acknowledging Raphael's observation honestly. "Grace has that effect," he admitted. "She reminds me there's more to life than business and power." Raphael studied him thoughtfully. "Does she know the full truth about your world yet?" he asked carefully. Marco's expression grew slightly more serious. "Not entirely," he admitted. "I've told her generally about my business dealings, but not the complete truth about everything involved." Raphael nodded understandingly, though concern remained evident in his tone. "You should tell her soon, boss," he advised carefully. "Before she learns it from someone else, under worse circumstances." Marco considered Raphael's advice seriously, understanding clearly the wisdom behind his caution. "You're right," he agreed quietly. "I'll tell her soon, completely and honestly." That evening, Marco visited Grace again, his expression thoughtful and slightly nervous as he prepared to share more openly about his true business dealings. Grace noticed his unusual seriousness immediately. "Is something wrong?" she asked gently, concern evident in her voice. Marco took a deep breath, deciding finally to be completely honest. "Grace, there's more about my business you deserve to know," he began carefully. "My world is complicated, sometimes dangerous. I've protected you from certain realities, but I don't want secrets between us any longer." Grace listened carefully as Marco explained honestly and thoroughly about the true nature of his organization, his position of power, and the inherent dangers involved. Though clearly surprised by the full scope of his revelations, Grace remained remarkably calm, processing the information thoughtfully rather than reacting with fear or judgment. "Thank you for telling me honestly," she said finally, genuine appreciation evident in her tone. "I suspected there was more beneath the surface, but I appreciate your honesty now." Marco studied her carefully, relieved yet still slightly anxious. "Does this change anything between us?" he asked quietly. Grace considered his question thoughtfully before answering honestly. "It doesn't change how I feel about who you are as a person," she said gently. "But I won't pretend the danger doesn't concern me, especially now that I understand more clearly." Marco nodded, understanding completely her cautious honesty. "I'll do everything possible to protect you, Grace," he reassured her firmly. "Whatever it takes." As their conversation deepened further that evening, both Marco and Grace understood clearly that their relationship had reached a significant turning point, one that would require trust, honesty, and courage to navigate the challenges still awaiting them ahead. Neither of them yet realized clearly just how soon and severely that trust and courage would be tested, as Victor's humiliation from weeks earlier quietly transformed into a dangerous plan for revenge. Since his humiliating removal from Marco's project, Victor Alvarez had grown increasingly bitter, his ambition and wounded pride festering steadily into dangerous resentment. Determined to reclaim his standing and prove Marco's judgment wrong, Victor began quietly plotting a way to force the bakery situation to a swift and permanent resolution, regardless of the consequences. He discovered quickly that Grace relied heavily on her young assistant Lily, both for daily bakery operations and as a close, trusted companion. Recognizing this connection as a potential weakness, Victor devised a reckless plan to kidnap Lily, hoping to pressure Grace into selling the bakery quickly, thereby proving his own value to Marco's stalled project. One quiet evening, as Lily left the bakery after her shift, Victor's men intercepted her quietly outside, quickly forcing her into a waiting vehicle before she could call for help. Panic gripped Lily instantly as she realized the seriousness of her situation, though she remained too frightened to fully process what was happening. When Grace discovered Lily missing shortly afterward, panic and fear flooded through her instantly. She quickly called Marco, her voice trembling with anxiety and fear. "Marco, Lily's missing," she said urgently. "She never showed up at home and she's not answering her phone." Marco's blood ran cold instantly, understanding immediately the seriousness of the situation. "I'll handle this right away," he reassured her firmly, though anger and concern colored his tone deeply. "Stay calm, Grace. I promise you we'll find her." Marco quickly summoned Raphael, urgency evident clearly in his tone. "Victor has taken Lily," Marco said firmly, barely containing his anger. "This is clearly an attempt to pressure Grace into selling the bakery." Raphael's expression grew serious immediately. "How do you want to proceed, boss?" "Find them immediately," Marco ordered firmly. "I want Victor's exact location within the hour." Raphael quickly mobilized their resources, tracking Victor's movements carefully through their extensive network of contacts and informants. Within a short time, They successfully traced Victor's location to an isolated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Marco arrived swiftly at the location, his men positioned strategically around the perimeter, prepared carefully for a decisive confrontation. Inside, Victor paced anxiously, clearly nervous about the recklessness of his own actions, while Lily sat frightened but unharmed, tied cautiously to a chair nearby. "Victor," Marco called out firmly, entering the warehouse directly, his tone cold and controlled despite his anger. "This ends now." Victor turned quickly, clearly startled by Marco's sudden arrival. "Marco," he said nervously, attempting to regain some composure. "This wasn't meant to escalate this far. I only wanted to resolve the bakery situation quickly." "By kidnapping an innocent young woman?" Marco replied sharply, anger evident clearly in his tone. "You've made a serious mistake, Victor." Victor hesitated, clearly recognizing the severity of his miscalculation. "I panicked," he admitted quietly. "I felt humiliated after you removed me from the project. I thought this would prove my usefulness." Marco studied him coldly, disappointment and anger evident clearly in his expression. "Instead, you've proven exactly why you were removed," Marco said firmly. "Release Lily immediately." Victor hesitated briefly, though quickly realizing the futility of further resistance against Marco's clear authority and controlled anger. Reluctantly, he nodded to his men, instructing them to release Lily immediately. Marco quickly moved to free Lily himself, gently helping her stand as she trembled with residual fear and relief. "You're safe now," he reassured her calmly. "Everything's going to be all right." Lily nodded gratefully, tears of relief streaming down her face as Marco's men escorted her carefully outside toward safety, while Marco remained behind briefly to address Victor directly. "This is your final warning, Victor," Marco said coldly. "If you ever threaten anyone under my protection again, there will be serious, permanent consequences." Victor nodded quickly, clearly understanding the seriousness of Marco's warning. "Understood," he replied quietly, humiliation and fear evident clearly in his expression. Marco turned and left the warehouse without further discussion, quickly rejoining Lily and his men outside, relief evident clearly as they safely transported her back toward the city, and back into Grace's anxious, waiting arms. When Grace saw Lily safely returned, she rushed forward immediately, embracing her tightly, relief and gratitude flooding through her instantly. "Thank God you're safe," Grace whispered, tears of relief evident clearly in her voice. Marco watched quietly, warmth and admiration evident clearly in his own expression as he observed Grace's genuine care and affection for her young assistant. Grace turned toward him afterward, gratitude and emotion clear in her tearful eyes. "Thank you, Marco," she said softly, embracing him gently as well. "For protecting her, for keeping your promise." Marco held her gently, relief and affection evident clearly in his own expression. "I'll always protect the people you care about, Grace," he said softly. "That's a promise I intend to keep completely." As they stood together quietly, relief and gratitude evident clearly between them, both Marco and Grace understood deeply that their bond had grown even stronger through this dangerous ordeal, setting the stage clearly for an important, life-changing decision Marco was preparing to make very soon. In the days following Lily's rescue, Marco found himself reflecting deeply on everything that had unfolded since first meeting Grace. What began as a straightforward business acquisition had transformed completely into something far more meaningful, forcing him to reconsider not just his approach to the development project, but his entire perspective on power, wealth, and genuine happiness. Raphael noticed Marco's thoughtful, distracted demeanor over several days, finally addressing it directly. "You've been quiet lately, boss," he observed carefully. "Something on your mind?" Marco nodded slowly, considering his words carefully before responding. "I've been thinking about the entire situation with Grace, the bakery, everything," he admitted honestly. "I don't think I can go through with forcing her out anymore, Raphael. Not after everything we've been through together." Raphael studied him thoughtfully, clearly unsurprised by this admission. "What will you do about the development project then?" he asked carefully. Marco considered his answer seriously, determination steadily forming clearly in his mind. "I have an idea," he said finally, a small genuine smile forming on his lips. One that might surprise everyone involved. Over the following days, Marco quietly arranged a private meeting with his development partners, carefully outlining a completely new proposal, one that diverged significantly from their original plans. Instead of insisting on acquiring Grace's bakery, Marco proposed redesigning the entire project around Sweet Grace, preserving it entirely while enhancing the surrounding development to complement rather than replace it. His partners initially hesitated, uncertain about this unconventional shift in strategy. "This changes our entire plan significantly," one partner said cautiously. "Are you certain this is the right decision?" Marco nodded firmly, conviction clear in his tone. "Absolutely certain," he replied confidently. Grace Turner's bakery represents genuine community value, something worth preserving rather than sacrificing for short-term convenience. I believe strongly this approach will ultimately benefit everyone involved, including our own reputation and community standing. After careful consideration, his partners reluctantly agreed, recognizing clearly the potential benefits of Marco's unconventional yet thoughtful proposal. With his new plan finalized, Marco arranged one final, meaningful visit to Sweet Grace Bakery, carefully preparing to share his surprising decision directly with Grace herself. He arrived one quiet afternoon, his expression calm yet clearly filled with anticipation and warmth. "Grace," he began carefully, drawing her attention gently away from her usual tasks. "I have something important to share with you." Grace studied him curiously, sensing clearly the seriousness and warmth evident in his tone. "What is it, Marco?" she asked gently. Marco took a deep breath, excitement and sincerity clear in his voice. "I've decided to redesign the entire development project around your bakery," he explained warmly. "Sweet Grace will remain exactly as it is, preserved completely, while the surrounding development enhances rather than replaces your grandmother's legacy." Grace's eyes widened in genuine surprise and emotion, tears forming quickly as she processed Marco's unexpected and heartfelt decision. "Marco, are you serious?" she asked, disbelief and gratitude evident clearly in her trembling voice. "Completely serious," Marco confirmed warmly, taking her hands gently in his own. "You've taught me the true value of genuine community, kindness and integrity, values I had nearly forgotten in pursuit of power and success. I want to help preserve that rather than destroy it." Overwhelmed with emotion, Grace embraced Marco tightly, gratitude and happiness clear in her tearful expression. "Thank you, Marco," she whispered softly. "This means more to me than you could ever imagine." News of Marco's unconventional decision quickly spread throughout the community, surprising and delighting local residents who had initially feared losing a beloved neighborhood institution. Marco's decision, initially met with skepticism from his business partners, ultimately earned him widespread admiration and respect, both within his organization and throughout the wider community. At a small community celebration organized shortly afterward, Marco stood proudly beside Grace, publicly acknowledging his admiration and affection for her clearly and openly. "Grace Turner has taught me something invaluable," he announced warmly to the gathered crowd. "True strength isn't measured by wealth or power, but by kindness, integrity and genuine dedication to what truly matters." The crowd applauded warmly, genuine admiration and respect evident clearly among the gathered community members, many of whom had initially doubted Grace's decision to reject Marco's substantial financial offer. As the celebration continued warmly around them, Marco turned to Grace privately, sincerity and affection clear in his gaze. "Thank you for teaching me the true meaning of genuine happiness," he said softly. "I couldn't imagine my life now without you in it." Grace smiled warmly, happiness and gratitude evident clearly in her own expression. "And I couldn't imagine mine without you either, Marco," she replied gently, her voice filled with genuine warmth and affection. As they stood together, surrounded by their supportive community, Marco and Grace understood clearly that their unconventional journey had led them exactly where they were meant to be, together, genuinely happy, and deeply committed to preserving the values that truly mattered most in life.